Welcome to the Bend Don't Break podcast. I'm Aaron Schweitzer, your host, with the always flexible co-hostess Laurel Bronze. This podcast is powered by The Source Weekly, Bend's locally owned newspaper. We are the fastest growing podcast in Central Oregon. Thank you, listeners. Listeners, tune in to find out how our community is adapting to living in our new normal. We are supported by Worthy Brewing, who live by their motto, Earth First, Beer Second. This week, we are chatting with Roger Lee, Chief Executive Officer for Economic Development for Central Oregon, or as most of us know it, EDCO. EDCO is a nonprofit dedicated to creating a diversified local economy. Roger graduated with a degree in international economics from the University of Washington. He's been the head of EDCO for 21 years. As CEO, he is responsible for economic development strategy in the Tri-County region, recruiting businesses from outside Central Oregon, helping develop industrial parks, and expanding commercial air service. Whew. He also worked as the director of the Baker City Economic Development Department. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's always an honor to be asked.
Thank you. Well, let's just start. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and how does one like yourself get into economic development?
Well, I guess I got a chance to see applied economics when I was on exchange in Germany. It happened to be in 1989, and there was something that happened at that time. The wall between the country I was living in and the whole eastern bloc there. So I got a chance to see a little bit of a difference between a command economy and more of a market economy. And the difference couldn't have been more stark. And I thought, man, how best to do that is in economic development. And so that's really kind of where I kind of got the bug for this, and worked in an internship right out of college, university there in downtown Seattle, in the tallest building on the West Coast, in the middle of downtown Seattle, and realized that I was not a city boy. Like Goldilocks, I went to a very small town in Eastern Oregon, Baker City, as you mentioned. Maybe it was a little too small, so Central Oregon just felt just right.
How old were you when you were in Germany at that time when the wall came down?
When I first moved there, I was 19. I think I turned 20 by the time I left.
Yeah, pretty impressionable.
Yeah, I was. I actually got to, in an era of where we've got lots of demonstrations and in some cases riots. I got to participate in what they call demonstrations light, which is where it all got started. They would start with a church service at a church right near where the kind of town square is, and then they would march around. There's like 120,000 people with all the East German and Russian soldiers lined up with their automatic weapons.
Wow!
And nothing ever happened. I mean, it's amazing the kind of social change that happened in that country, and economic change, and not a single life lost and all that.
I've never heard that term, command economy. It's a pretty interesting way of putting it. Like, you will build this now, you will sell this, and
yeah, they did their best to estimate what was needed and when and so forth. But you just had to go to any town, and and I've been to Russia several times as well. Since you go anywhere and try to find something on the shelves, and it was usually not there. So the allocation from above really wasn't working so well.
The commands were not executed very well.
I think everybody, all the initiative kind of lost its luster.
Right. Yeah. Well, 21 years at EDCO. That's quite a commitment for this day and age when everybody moves around so much, and it's becoming somewhat of an oddity. How have you stayed so committed?
Well, it could be that I'm just unemployable anywhere else. So that might be.
You're unemployable.
Yeah, that might be the right answer. No, I think doing this work, it's very difficult. I think the average tenure of someone in this profession is like 3 to 5 years, and in 3 years, you're just finally developing the contacts you need to do this work, I think, more efficiently and effectively. And so I'm a big preacher about some longevity in this role for folks who are just entering it, and
sure.
on our team as well. It's like when you stick with it, you really start to develop some returns. And I think the work, say that John Stark has done up in Redmond for Ready is a great example of that, where, you know, people know how to get, I mean, he knows how to get things done there, and people know to how to find him and access the resources that Ready has. So I'm a big believer in that, and I've seen it kind of play out, just not in our state, but in other parts of the country and the world, actually.
Sure. Well, let's dive into some COVID economy talk. Let's start with things you've noted. Let's say on the positive side for now. What are some of the things that you see that have been maybe a plus for how people are working through COVID from a business perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel like we're a little bit lopsidedly blessed with having a group of companies that have been generally less impacted. That doesn't mean that 100% of them are in that boat, but you know, we have had most of the 1,000 or so companies we work with across the Tri-County region. Their major customers are somewhere else, and so they're not dependent upon the local economy. Some are national, some, you know, some of it's national, international, some of it's other customers in the state. It's weird when you have a pandemic and all those other places are being impacted at the same time. But I would say remarkably, most of our manufacturing and tech firms have either kind of held their ground, the losses they've had are manageable, or and it's kind of, some of it's by sector, and sometimes in that sector there are companies that are, you know, beating the trends as well. But I think we're in a small single digit percentage of those 1,000 companies that are really, I think, struggling today, which is not good for that percentage of companies that are. But I think in general that bodes well for our recovery. It bodes well for those companies, you know, probably coming out stronger than they were before, to be able to kind of power us through a really solid recovery like we had from the Great Recession. I know folks that at that time said, man, this place will never recover. And, you know, it was all doom and gloom. And my forecast at that time was say, well, we will have some of the highest price increases for housing anywhere in the country as a result of what happened in the Great Recession, because we lost so much value. And yet all the fundamentals of this area didn't change. I mean, it was still a great place to, you know, to live, a great place for young families to move, to educate their kids. I think it speaks to that, you know, the fundamentals this area has. It's really, you know, population growth has been a steady component of our kind of economic growth here. And that certainly seems not to be a compromise at all with COVID.
Before we move into Zoomtown stuff, are there any, let's talk maybe a little bit about the negatives. What are some of the things that you think could have a real long-term impact for the region, and just other things you might be seeing in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, there are sectors of our economy, and I think if you look back, again, maybe a comparison to where we were 10, 12 years ago, we had probably almost 3 times the weighting of your construction employment that most communities, average communities would have. So you kind of in that 4.5% range, and I think we were almost 11% at that time. So you know, if that goes to 3%, there goes, you know, 8% employment rate immediately. And I think similarly, we've been heavily weighted on tourism here. I think it represents about 17% of our job base in the region. And it is a demand generator for the work that we do for helping companies, because a lot of those visitors, you know, say, man, this is a great place. How do I figure out how to get back there?
Right.
Move my business there, et cetera. So, you know, that visitor industry has been among the hardest hit, and, you know, I think will continue. It's amazing how quickly it's rebounded, though. So I think there's going to be some fallout in that industry, and certainly as a component of that is kind of the restaurant and retail both. I don't know that a lot of those businesses can weather what's still ahead in 2021. People are not going to return, you know, immediately, even if everybody has a vaccine. It's taken a long time, I think, to kind of whip people into enough fear to not do things that they did before, and it won't just be immediate before they come out. So that's something I think will have a drag effect for us going into 21. At the same time, we're very confident that 21's a recovery year for a whole bunch of different reasons. So a little.
I agree about the recovery, but I do, and maybe you've seen this too. I kind of get concerned about folks who, the analogy I use is the person who's hiking with you, and as you're going up the mountain, they're like, "Oh, I think that's the top right there," and then you get to that one, you're like, "Oh, false summit," and it's gonna be. My feeling is that the summit it's further off than people want to believe, and there's been so much hype about this vaccine, and I continually talk to folks who are like, well, we're almost out of this thing, and I can't discourage them. I want to give them that attaboy for their positivity, but it's just not what I'm seeing.
Yeah, there's when we've kind of been talking about this for at least 4 months, I would say that the other foot's coming to fall. Really in this first 6 months of 21, where folks have maybe, we have a term for it when it comes to startups that maybe have received capital, but they've not been able to gain market traction.
Yeah, right.
They become zombies. And so they're maybe not out of business, but they're probably on their way to being out of business. And I think we probably have quite a number of businesses in the sectors I just mentioned that are zombies, that are just, like a little bit more capital from another round of federal stimulus is not enough to
Right.
get through. And so maybe like contractors in the Great Recession, I think we're going to have this major attrition of restaurants and retail, storefronts and so forth, especially as people have said, well, I don't have to go to the storefront. I can just have it delivered right to my house for free.
Right.
It's really forced some of those trends to greater adoption than they had in the past. And so those are all, I think, headwinds for businesses that haven't been able to figure out how to pivot, who just aren't able to.
Right.
And, some in-person is really an important part of that. I was a board member of a nonprofit that had that as their business model to train high school students and learning about business. And so you'd have business mentors. You mentioned Brooks Resources, Mike Holler, and spent a week of his life helping these high school students as an advisor. OSU Cascades, when they hold them on university campuses. And unfortunately, after 13 years, and that's your business model, we just couldn't. The business or the nonprofit couldn't survive. There was just no path out of there on a virtual kind of a platform. So there's going to be that attrition that happens out there, and I don't know that there's enough money in the federal coffers, not to mention the state coffers, to help keep those folks in business.
Let's talk a little bit about the Zoomtown concept. It seems to come up on every show and that we have here. And, there's some really positive things about it. It's probably contributed to real estate prices going up. And probably it might create service jobs. But, I'm wondering from your perspective, is there anything outside of those things that might be good? Do you see any companies like wanting to relocate to Bend because of this phenomenon of like a kind of a flexible workforce that's able to work from home?
Yes, I think, Laurel, that we've already experiencing some of that. In fact, we just reported yesterday to our board of directors. We have, regular board meetings, and then quarterly we report back as far as what our results were. And our business is, by its very nature, lumpy. So a project you started 3.5 years ago might actually happen in this quarter, or it may happen next quarter or 5 quarters from now. But we had our best quarter, and since we've been tracking the information since 1993, this fourth quarter of 2020, remarkably enough. And that's really in terms of projects that closed and what we call done deals. And so relocations that happened, and we don't count a relocation just when a company makes a public announcement and says, hey, we're moving to Bend. It's when they actually move here. When they lease space, when they hire employees, then that's when we count it.
Pretty good stats for EDCO though, Roger. If you could just say that,
Yeah.
5 people are telecommuting for here, so notch that as a business move to Bend.
Yeah. These are businesses with physical locations primarily. So back to the Zoom towns, that's impacting their business because they'll have remote workers and other places that are doing that. But we had almost 20 deals in one quarter, which I can go back to years in the organization's history where that was an annual number that was even less than that. So pretty remarkable. And I think one of the other things that's interesting about that is both a mix of tech and manufacturing, as well as a mix of the types of industries. So it's back to that diversification.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about housing. You've led a number of presentations about this topic, particularly the dearth of middle-class housing in Bend, and it seems to be an ongoing topic in local politics. I was wondering if you could just weigh in on your opinions about what our elected leaders are doing, and if you think they're doing enough and other things that could be done.
Great question. I would say in Bend in particular, I really have to applaud the efforts of the city of Bend and its leadership. I mean, to set a goal and say, hey, we want to see this many units on the ground, I think was pretty bold. I haven't seen too many cities do that in Oregon or other states to say, we have this goal, we're behind in housing, and let's see if we can push the boundaries. And I think in Bend's case, that number of 3,000 units over a 2-year period was about double what they were doing prior to. And I think it's interesting to see what we've seen. It's not our industry we play a whole lot in. We're dealing mostly with, businesses in this, what we call traded sector. But we saw it align processes inside the city to say, oh, well, this particular, piece of land has these issues with entitlements or whatever. And how can we align those in our community development department, in our building department, and public works to make that more viable in the marketplace. And so I applaud the effort of the city to set that as a goal and have departments kind of align underneath that. I think some of the criticisms the city's taken, and I feel like there's just more progress to be made rather than throwing any stones, is that what's that mix of housing? How much of that is more on the middle income housing or affordable housing side? It's probably, it has been a mix. We've had more multifamily built, I think, in that 2-year period than easily the decade before that, maybe even longer. So it is a nice mix of different types of housing. Is it all the affordable or kind of what we like to consider kind of workforce housing? Can the person that's serving you at a restaurant or doing your dry cleaning or, teaching your kids, can they afford that house? That's another question. And maybe that's the next stage for Ben as far as boxes they can try to check. And I'm a big fan of trying to encourage the market to build what you want. We have, I would say, very successful affordable housing entities in Oregon comes to Housing Works and Habitat for Humanity. Some of the ones that come out of the home builders like First Story. I think they do great work, but on their best day and their best year, they're only going to develop a small percentage of the housing that's going to be constructed here. And so how do you encourage folks to build a different product? And I think it's really driven home by when you reveal, like, what are some of the issues around this? It's like, well, lot price has a lot to do with it.
Sure.
Probably has as much to do with it as system development charges, et cetera. And if your average kind of all-in lot price is $200,000, it becomes very difficult to build anything affordable in that kind of a range. So
yeah, I've become, short of command housing, as we should call it, maybe, I've just become a real skeptic that that Bend can, in the short, even to medium term, get a handle on what it means to have an asset like this, where it's gorgeous. I mean, as much as you want to try to implement a lot of housing strategies, they seem like they're up against, for your term, headwinds of every lot is super expensive. There's not a lot of capacity. We got way behind the eight ball, and now we're just a very affluent town, and it feels like we're headed towards Aspen. And I mean, I got to imagine in your conversations trying to get business to move here. I mean, I know we do it all the time in hiring. It's like, it's the conversation. How do you feel about living in Redmond? How do you feel about commuting? How do you, for depending on the salary range we're talking about? How real is that for you?
Oh, it's definitely real. And it's not just, a frontline worker that has no experience that's kind of working on the job and learning what they're doing for the first time. It's software engineers. It's higher paying jobs where folks are like, oh, wow, I'm moving from a bigger city, and depending on where that's at in the country, they could be having some sticker shock of moving here. So that was a concern for us back before we had this huge correction. In fact, that correction, although it created a lot of pain and agony out there financially, it was like we needed that correction.
Right.
Appreciation rates going up, double digit every year, that compounds very quickly, and suddenly you're in a spot where those are the places we go to recruit.
Right.
Because they're struggling with housing prices. But it's a complicated issue, and there are no easy answers. But I do know that the city of Bend pursued about a 10,000 acre expansion that was essentially slapped down by the state and said, "Oh no, you're dreaming. You go back to the drawing board." And what eventually was approved was something in that 2,500 range. So a quarter of what was requested, to kind of try to get ahead of it a little bit, even though I think at that time, we were way behind. So you look at maybe other communities, and I think communities with a strong demand for in-migration or for housing and just in general, are kind of perpetually behind the eight ball when it comes to this affordability issue and land, and dealing with land price.
Right.
Look 35 miles away to Prineville, for example, lot prices are not a big deal there. You can still buy lots 35 minutes from Bend for $30,000 to $40,000, and that's just kind of remarkable to me that same piece of dirt is going to be in the 200 250 range in Bend.
Well, who would have thought that Prineville would be a bedroom community for Bend, or a place that people would commute from? I mean, certainly not in my recent memory, but I hear about it. I mean, people float that to me frequently.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, one of the things I wanted to throw out, and this is total speculation on my part, but is there a point at which, when a community passes into this high affluence range, when you have housing going upward of 600,000 for an average, are there companies that start to go, oh, that's where I want to be? That becomes an asset. I mean, we always talk about it for those companies that are trying to find lower income workers. But is there a category or a group out there that would find that more appealing as we move into that stratosphere?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think from my answer from doing this work for almost 3 decades is no.
Yeah.
No company that says, I'm going to look at your place because you have high housing costs. It's usually quite the opposite. It's like to disqualify you because you have high housing costs.
It hasn't stopped Manhattan. That's why or San Francisco. So
it has hindered San Francisco.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been that, and I think the business climate in California have both very strong headwinds against keeping companies in that area. We don't necessarily peg ourselves as a peer to the Bay Area. It's just kind of this Disneyland when it comes to, for startups and venture capital and kind of, innovation and so forth. So Boulder is maybe, more.
Yeah,
even Austin isn't a great comparison anymore because it's gotten so big. But let's say Boulder, which is not really a fair comparison because they're so close to Denver and so forth. And they've, probably had a 20-year head start on us, but maybe a place we can look to learn from some things as well. Their average home price, I think now is 900,000. There are still companies coming in there, but they're finding other communities in that front range that are new, older. They may still have a presence there, but I think that's an example of where we've learned, like, we've got to do something different than Boulder, because they've essentially drawn a line around the community and said there's really no new development happening. And they did that, many years before Oregon's land use system. They did uniquely in the state of Colorado, and so you got to tear something down in order to build something. And that's not Oregon's land use system. It's concentric circles around urban centers, but that system, I think, is really being tested right now as far as the affordability factor for high demand places. In low demand places, Oregon's land use system works great.
Yeah.
High demand places, I think it is really kind of failing our state.
Well, I do know that, that Zoom phenomenon, you hear the Southeast is just getting an incredible influx of folks. I know that a lot of people are migrating. A lot of personalities and folks in the media have pegged Texas or Nashville or places like that for movement. You've seen, it makes quite the headlines when someone like Oracle picks up and goes from California to Texas. Texas is reaping a windfall from these prices.
Yeah, there's Texas is an interesting one because their land use. If you're in Houston, there isn't any land use. They kind of pride themselves as like, you can build a factory next to a neighborhood, to a pig farm, and it's like, other places have obviously not always followed the Houston model, but housing prices in that state remain reasonably affordable still, which is a little bit of a head scratcher for us. I think it must mean because there aren't any city boundaries. You can just build wherever you want. Maybe a little similar to my home state of Idaho, where, if there's a highway there and you can access it and somehow we can get water and sewer there, you can probably build a neighborhood.
Oh, I used to live in Boise. If there's a place that I would just fear for Bend, it is that run from Boise to Ontario, where land use is an afterthought in the desire to get some housing up. So,
and I think most Oregonians agree with you, Aaron, that they like how we've developed, and we still have these open spaces between communities. It's much more, to go back to our initial conversation, it's much more like living in Germany. Germany is about the size of Oregon and Washington combined, but yet it has 80 million people. California is way bigger than that, and they're not even at 40 yet. So it's worked pretty well in a country that's pretty land limited, but with a lot of people. And so it's just, right now it feels like it's kind of the Bible and it can't be revised at all, instead of maybe providing some flexibility in places where the land use system is not the only, but a contributing factor to this housing unaffordability.
Yeah, it does feel like there's pressures right now to have that conversation. Especially, if we're thinking about something that comes from the pandemic, certainly I don't feel like people in Bend, because they've been quarantined since March, can appreciate how many people have moved here and what it's going to look like when they all come out of their Zoom homes and hit the streets and pack the restaurants. And there'll be good problems to have, but I think the community's changed more than people can see visually. Yeah. And you can tell by the housing prices. It's not the town it was a year ago. We can't tell, but I just haven't seen, I don't think it's from a lack of political will. I just don't hear any viable solutions coming from government that show me how you're going to bring the housing prices down, how you're going to open up affordable housing. And stuff's floated, but I like you said, there's got to be a deeper conversation somewhere.
Yeah, some of it's really at the state level, but again, back to Ben's credit, I think of like the cottage code. You could do a cottage code zoning which basically says your standard single family home, which in Bend has meant, okay, if I've got a 5,000 square foot lot, I'm going to put a 2,500 or 3,000 square foot home on it. And that precipitates then a much higher, selling price than if it's a 900 or 1,000 or 1,100 square foot home. And if you look at Ben's old housing stock, this is the kind of stuff I play with, my free time, of moving houses that are going to get demoed and thrown in the landfill. And so I, like an idiot, pick them up and, some infill lot and give them a new life, and so forth. But they're rarely ever bigger than that kind of a footprint.
Right.
We're just not building much of that. And we haven't been building much of it for decades. And so you can't really fault the building community for wanting to maximize that. If you're paying that much for a lot, to put a 900 square foot home on it, I don't think so.
Right.
If you have a zoning, and this isn't command real estate, I would say it's like, what kind of mix do we want to include with what we already have? And if you had, like, say, new areas that are coming in to say, well, this has got a cottage zone on it. Those cottages can be super attractive, but
right,
maybe 3 times more affordable, because maybe you can put 3 cottages on 2 lots, and the smaller footprint makes it a lot more affordable, just like they were in a much different period of time, obviously, back when, this was a mill town.
So we're kind of running out of time here. To close us out, I was hoping you could give us a little rundown of some of the, more exciting or notable companies that have come here or started over the last, 2 to 5 years. You introduced me to Dutchy, which is a cannabis online sales platform, and we had talked about Layered Superfood. Maybe you could talk a little bit about those guys, or any other businesses you think would be interesting for our listeners to know about.
Sure. You've mentioned 2 of the high flyers of our early stage companies. These are companies weren't even in existence here, but they were founded here, 3-4 years ago. And they're both firms that are, I think, over 120 people now. One in little town of Sisters, the other one here in Bend with Dutchy. And Dutchy, I think there was a stat on Dutchy that they, or 10% of all the online cannabis sales in the world are using their platform. So that kind of market penetration precipitates capital, and that capital grows a base of jobs here that helps support all those customers. So I think that's just a great example of how someone has figured out a market niche to be able to capitalize on. And, Laird is in that kind of the same boat in the kind of the specialty food industry. And, they've really been able to grow in Sisters. I think they're now in their 4th building. They just keep growing as they can find land and buildings, they're occupying those. And they're actually buying companies now too. They recently bought a Peely Net company. So, you have, again, that kind of capital comes together. It winds up being able to fuel growth and jobs here in our region. And right now, the portfolio of those types of companies, maybe a different stage, maybe not quite the rocket ships that those have been. We have 96 companies we're working with that are really promising in the early stage arena. Everything from outdoor gear and apparel companies to specialty food companies, tech, including video games to proprietary software. Those are all things that are kind of growing up here. And we've really not seen in this acute recession, we've had a drop off of startups, which you'd think would be like, people are like, holy smokes, this is not the time I want to start a business, but they're starting them, and not in small numbers. And then our recruitment efforts, which we kind of characterize as the move part of Move, Start, Grow. We're seeing a variety of companies, a lot of them from larger areas, that say, I'm ready to get out. I've seen the light. I'm ready to get out of this bigger metro. And the vast majority of those companies are pretty small. So they're not, big players, but I mean, we have one company right now that's looking at the region. It's a manufacturer, and it's, a couple 100,000 square feet that they would build, and hundreds of people they would employ. But the more, kind of middle road is going to be in that, 10 to 15 range of businesses, which we think is a great fit for Bend. we have the space to kind of, accommodate those businesses. And it's a full range of types of companies that are moving here as well. I'll maybe mention one. I think environmentally and kind of maybe what you're putting on your body conscious deodorant company called Smarty Pits. That's coming out of aluminum-free deodorant that is just ramping up and getting into production here in Bend. So that's a recruitment here from this past year as an example.
Roger, we're running out of time.
Yep.
But
Okay.
really appreciate you joining us and sharing Smarty Pits, especially.
Or as a
But,
banjo company moving out of the out of the Midwest to sisters,
right.
et cetera.
I'm going to follow up with you a little more on that cottage code zoning. I'm fascinated about these kind of things as we continue to explode and look at infill and ADUs. But Roger, thanks for being on the Bend Don't Break podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks very much for the invitation.